My name is Dave Kraus, and I'll be kicking off today's webinar. I am the Tree Fund trustee and the chair of the Communications Committee that collaborates with our Tree Fund staff on communication strategy for our organization. Before we start the webinar, I wanted to share some information about the Tree Fund. The Tree Fund was established in 2002 with the mission to support scientific discovery and dissemination of new knowledge in the fields of arboriculture and urban forestry. We cultivate innovation in arboriculture by issuing research grants, primarily applied research in how to better plant, propagate, and care for urban trees as opposed to forests, providing scholarships to students in arboriculture, urban forestry, horticulture, and related studies, funding education for kids K through 12 related to trees and environmental stewardship. In 2017, we awarded $225,000 in new grants, paid $210,000 toward prior multi-year grants, and increased the endowment that funds research in perpetuity by $600,000 to a total of $4.4 million. You can see how the Tree Fund raises money for the grants and scholarships. Individual donations, endowment earnings, partnerships, community engagement events, and legacy giving. Here are the areas of research that we focus on: root and soil management, plant healthcare, urban forestry, technology transfer, risk assessment for worker safety, and propagation in planting and establishment. We have several research grant lines at a variety of funding levels throughout the year. And you can see here on the slide, we have the Highland Johns Grant, Utility Arborist Grant, which is new, the John Dooling Grant, Safe Arborist Techniques, and Jack Kimmel. The recipient of our first Utility Arborist Grant, which supports research of importance to utility tree care professionals, will be announced next month in June. And you can find information about these, including application periods, on our website, treefund.org. We now have 5 scholarship lines available. The Ohio Chapter ISA Educational Grant is our only educational grant in 2018. All of the education grant scholarships recipients will be announced in June as well. If you go to our website, you see all the research we funded through the years. I encourage you to go to the archives page of our website, and you can search by the keyword or scientist's name, and we have compiled a list of research projects by topic. After exploring our archives, you can also find other information on the Tree Fund website, including our 2018 webinar schedule and events such as the Tour de Trees cycling event. If you have any questions about the Tree Fund, please submit them in the chat box, and we'll try to answer those at the end of this webinar. And now at this time, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Lauren DePay, a PhD student at Utah State University, to introduce our featured presenter. Lauren?
So I'd like to introduce Whitney Cranshaw. He's a professor and Extension Specialist of Entomology at Colorado State. For the last 34 years, he has conducted a broadly based program that answers questions involving arthropod pests that are affecting horticultural commodities in Colorado, which include vegetables, shade trees, turfgrass, and specialty crops. And his research has resulted in over 80 refereed publications and several hundred publications related to extension and outreach. And before Whitney gets started, I just wanted to give a big thanks to Karen and the Tree Fund, Dave, for helping us bring the speaker here today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Whitney.
So the topic that I'd like to cover is kind of a review of some of the ways that insects have come and gone on shade trees here in this part of the country. And this part of the country is pretty different from what many of you are used to. When we're talking about what's the urban forest in these western states, it is almost entirely human modified. very few of the plants are native, and of course, very few of the insects are native. Also, there's going to be some aspects of geography that are a little different out here, mountains and large treeless plains, for example. So, for instance, typical area that we're talking about where most people live in eastern Colorado is the Front Range, and this is what it would look like in terms of the kinds of plant communities. Essentially no trees where people live. The conifers start in the foothills, and then as you go to the lower elevations, and the lower elevation in Colorado is about 3,500 feet, but it's largely treeless, with the trees that do occur mostly occurring around rivers, and the trees that would be native out here would be almost entirely cottonwoods or perhaps some box elder. So the original towns were largely treeless, and we have modified them over time. So what we see now is very different from what was there originally. Also, the insects were very different. If we were to go back to the pictures I just showed and what the original area looked like, if we're talking about insects, none of the insects I'm going to talk about now would be an issue. We did have insects back then, and just as a little note, an insect that was big when Colorado first became a state was something called the Rocky Mountain locust. And if you've never heard about that, this is an insect that produced the biggest swarms of insects that have ever been seen. During the mid-1870s. This pictures of downtown Colorado Springs covered in grasshoppers during the outbreak in '75. During those years, a completely devastated a wide swath of this part of the country. And this Rocky Mountain locust, which at one point, again, was the most abundant insect ever seen on the planet, is no longer with us. It was found in numbers that darkened the skies in the 1870s, but in 1902 was found for the last time alive. So things change, and that was just that's just the beginning of how things have changed. So we're getting new bugs all the time into this area. Every year that I've had this job, found at least 3 or 4 new insects on plants that we previously did not know about. And where do they come from? Some of them come from outside North America and were introduced onto this continent, usually by accident. Others are new bugs to our region, but they've got expansions of their range, so they weren't in this area. They weren't in the western states. They were maybe in the Midwest or in the Pacific states, and they have expanded their range, often with some human assistance, meaning people have moved them around. So we're talking about, the title here is Invasive Insects on Shade Trees and Shrubs, and taking the classic definition of invasive species, it would be a non-native or alien to the ecosystem under consideration, which would be the urban forests here in a western state. And also the definition includes the introduction causes or is likely to cause some sort of economic or environmental harm. And since pretty much everything we're talking about is non-native, it is a little different from how we would think about it in maybe an eastern or northwestern kind of situation. You know, and not always are these introduced insects or arthropods deleterious. I mean, lady beetles are a group that are generally considered beneficial, but and we have native species, perhaps about 80 species here in Colorado, but some of the ones we see most commonly now on our shade trees, the multicolored Asian lady beetle and the 7-spotted lady beetle. These are not North American species, but they are quite common in our urban forests. And then some familiar animals that are also considered beneficial or familiar. The mantid, the common mantids we have around here are a European mantid. The roly-poly, perhaps one of the most familiar animals in this part of the country, that's a European. All our daddy longlegs, they're all European, and all earthworms. We have no native earthworms in this state. Every earthworm we see is a European species that was brought here. And then finally, the honeybee. I think most people realize that is not a native insect to this part of the country. We do have 940 species that are native to Colorado, but the honeybee is not one of them. Anyway, let's get more talking about what's on trees. And when a new bug comes into the state and it is associated with trees, various things can happen. For one, it may fail to ever establish. It gets brought in and then just doesn't take. And it's hard to know how often that happens because usually these are small introductions and nobody never comes to anybody's attention, but I'm sure it happens constantly. And two examples of insects that I have seen repeatedly introduced in the state and never seen take would be the bagworm, which can be a problem in the adjacent state of Oklahoma, but has never become an issue here in Colorado despite it being brought in fairly regularly. Similarly, the mimosa webworm, although a honey locust is a huge plant in our urban forest, mimosa webworm never seems to have established in this state. Sometimes we get things that establish. Yes, they come in and we can see them reproducing, but they just don't seem to amount to much. And perhaps an example here would be root weevils. Root weevils are a group of beetles that develop on roots, a couple different genera. But it seems like every year, every other year at least, there's another kind of root weevil that comes to our attention that came here on some kind of nursery stock, and it gets established but doesn't seem to amount to much. So in general, I would say probably those are ones that we're getting, but they don't do much here. If there is one that may be impacting, there is one root weevil that I see everywhere now, and I see it not only here, but I see it in Wyoming and Montana, is lilac root weevil. Very common and pretty distinctive kind of injury it makes with this cutting along the leaf edge. And the big three hosts that we're seeing this on are common lilac, privet, and peony. Since these root weevils have a larval stage on the roots of usually the same plant, that would often be more injurious. So perhaps we do have some issues with this lilac root weevil, but most of them don't seem to amount to much. And then maybe I'm going out on a limb here with this one, but brown marmorated stink bug, big insect in the eastern U.S. Has a lot of attention given to this insect. Occurs on shade trees, also occurs in fruit crops and other crops, and then comes into houses. I have had this. This has been found in this state multiple times. A few here, a few there. Excuse me. But never have I seen it the following year. It just seems to not do well. It's even been introduced in my neighborhood. I had a guest from Pennsylvania who brought them in their car. I saw it in their car. So this has been introduced countless times, but at least in eastern Colorado, this is one that's not taking. So other things love it here, but some don't. So another situation might be one that is of minor importance for a while and then later becomes more important. These would be ones I'd call a sleeper pest because they kind of hang out for a while and then for some reason they explode. And although it's a little off the topic of shade trees, one of these would be the European earwig. This is an insect that got into the western states in the 1950s. And so it's been here a long time and it was well distributed, but it never attracted much attention until very recently in the last decade. And for some reason, this thing has exploded. Now, this is an insect that has some issues on shrubs. It's an omnivore, a true omnivore, so we'll see it feeding on the leaves of many kinds of plants. Exploded about 10 years ago, started to pick up a lot more questions about this and a lot more interest in people seeing more damage by this. So it did start to increase perhaps a decade or so ago in many areas of the state where it had always been, but had never been very important. And probably the reason for this is related to mulches. That's probably, there's been increases in earwigs elsewhere, and nobody really knows why, but probably the increased use of these mulches in our yards has contributed to providing improved habitat for them. Anyway, an insect that has increased after a long period when it was not very abundant. Earwigs, by the way, I should point out, are true omnivores, and they not only feed on plants, but they also feed on a lot of insects. And I think earwigs may also be part of the reason some other insects have declined in abundance, notably elm leaf beetle, which the earwigs will feed on. Another example of a sleeper species would be one of the elm insects, and I'm going to come up with many elm insect examples around here. Elm leaf miner. This is an insect that was apparently widespread and well established in eastern Colorado prior to 1980, but in low numbers. Something happened in the early 2000s where this thing exploded, and now it's quite a regular insect. So the incidence of this went much greater, tenfold greater than it had been in the past. So those would be examples of ones that kind of lingered for a while and then blew up. Now, I want to briefly divert from this whole, make a brief diversion. When we talk about invasive insects, using this definition, talking about non-natives and they cause damage. But the situation out here is so different, and since we have the plant communities we have are usually involve non-native plants, I think another topic I'd like to bring up is what about situations where we have some native insects that act invasively or act in a more harmful way? Insects that formerly weren't doing anything but then shift in their abundance. And there's a couple of examples of native species that I would say have acted more invasively over the past 30 years. So native insects acting badly. One of these would be spruce hips. This is a bark beetle affecting Colorado blue spruce. It's a native of the area, never reported to be damaging until we had serious drought conditions in the early 2000s, 2000 to 2003. Serious drought in this part of the country. Spruce hips exploded, came out of nowhere. Never before it had been an issue, but it became an issue during that period because the trees were under such drought stress. Spruce hips has remained a problem since that time in our urban forests where we do have drought issues. But that's one that changed its habit. Kind of an example that another example that intrigued me involved an insect on oak. Gamble oak borer. So this is a borer that develops in the native oak we have out here. Gamble oak. It's kind of a shrubby oak, and had a scientific name attached to it. Nothing else. It never attracted attention. It was just in Gamble oak, occasionally causing some limb dieback. The Gamble oak borer exploded during that drought period, 2001, 2002, and then in 2003, enormous numbers developed in those Gamble oak stands we had. This precipitated a massive flight from the native stands of Gamble oak that moved into the urban areas of Colorado, particularly the Denver area, and caused considerable death of red oak trees, another host. So basically what we had in 2003 was a flight of over 30 miles from areas south of Denver where the Gamble oak borer developed and in high populations, flew throughout the Denver metro area and was in such numbers that they colonized trees and killed them in a single year. The next year, it rained, and the Gamble oak borer went away. But this was really illustrative, like, I think, of a couple of things. One, how things can shift in abundance from being non-pest to a pest, but also how things can fly long distances out here in this part of the country. Largely treeless, once they get in flight, they have the ability to move long distances. So you'll hear, say, with emerald ash borer, that emerald ash borer can only fly a half a mile or a mile or so. That's in the same genus as gamble oak borer. Well, we had a cloud of agrarilus flying 30 miles in 2003 in this part of the country. So a native insect acting badly, which I think brings up a kind of an interesting situation, was that gamble oak borer. And then another situation where we had unusual dispersal out here was the mountain pine beetle breakout in 2009. Now, if you know much about this part of the country, mountain pine beetle is probably the most important single forest insect. So it's up in the high country, attacking pines, mostly lodgepole pine. And in recent period, we've had quite a big outbreak of mountain pine beetle. Kind of peaked in 2008, 2009, and we've lost many millions of trees. But it was a situation up in the high country, not where people are living along the Front Range in Colorado. Well, in late August of 2009, there was a bizarre event where all of a sudden people would come out the next day and see pine trees that were being hammered by mountain pine beetle dozens of miles, even hundreds of miles away from where the mountain pine beetles were developing in the forest. So here in Fort Collins, we're at the base of the mountains, Loveland, and Windsor, this area here, one day there would be no mountain pine beetle. The next, the trees were being hammered. You see the pitch tubes. Trees were infested during that event as far away as Sterling in northeast Colorado and into the Nebraska Panhandle. Now this is 150 miles from where they came. So in one day in August, a cloud of mountain pine beetle flew 150 miles, and in some cases were in such abundance that they killed trees. So this is the breakout of that, the areas that got infested again, as far as 150 miles from where they would have originated in a single day blowout event. Scotch pine was highly preferred. The majority of attacks occurred on this species. Scotch pine is one that produces a vigorous pitch out, and for the most part, they were able to resist attacks. A few trees were killed, about 10 to 15% of the trees were killed, but in most cases, the trees were able to successfully pitch out and kill these invading insects. Following up the next year, mountain pine beetle was developing in some of the trees at this lower elevations. You found changes in how they were developing. Life history was accelerated, and indirect evidence that they were coming out earlier the next year. It did burn out. It was not sustained, but there was evidence that in 2010 there was another smaller blowout event. Anyway, I think the gamble oak borer and this blowout event with the mountain pine beetle are illustrative of how things can move in unusual ways in this part of the country in terms of long distance dispersal, something I don't think you would see in New England or in the Pacific Northwest. And then there are some insects that just came out of nowhere. They were here, not doing much, and then all of a sudden they become a big issue. Aspen is a very commonly planted tree around here, although it probably shouldn't be because it doesn't do so well down here, but belongs up in the high country. But anyway, people like to plant their aspen. And one of the more conspicuous things that shows up on aspen is a gall. We call it the poplar twig gall, caused by the poplar twig gall fly. And it makes a gall on the new growth of aspen. So this might be what you'd see, the little swellings, and at this time of year, the insect would be inside that. The adults come out. They should be out pretty soon around here, and when the new shoots come out, they'll lay their eggs in that, and then the young will develop and make that gall. The galls, unlike other gall makers that you see the galls are have cumulative effects. Only the current season twigs are galled, but once a tissue is galled, it remains. It continues to swell. So the picture in the upper left shows an aspen that has galls that may have been produced 4, 5, 6 years beforehand. Anyway, bottom line, when I'm talking about this is an insect that is native to the area. Prior to 1990, this was an academic insect. It was listed as something that we could find here, but nobody ever saw it. Then there was this little outbreak. It was in the southern part of the Denver metro area around Littleton. Anyway, and trees such as the ones that are illustrated here were all looking lumpy. And then the next year is maybe 3 or 4 miles from there, and then 3 or 4 miles from there. And within 10, 12 years, essentially all of the state started to see greatly increased amounts of this twig gall. And this persists to this day. So something that prior to 1990 existed but wasn't an issue now is an issue. Furthermore, I've heard people from Minnesota to Idaho also ask questions about this, where it seems to be becoming much more abundant. So a native insect acts badly, goes wild. That happens here. And then the thousand cankers issue is one that maybe fits in here too, and this is a situation near and dear to my heart. So this is a problem that occurs on juglans, in particular walnuts, in particular black walnut, and it involves an unusual and lethal collaboration between insects and pathogens. Black walnut is the most susceptible host. Black walnut is not native to this part of the country, but it has been widely planted, although it is hard to find anymore because of this. The thousand cankers disease is a situation that involves two co-equal partners. The insect is a twig beetle, the walnut twig beetle, and it vectors a fungus, Geosmithia morbida. The fungus grows around the galleries of the developing beetles under the bark. So this picture here shows beetles that have been exposed under the bark, and the white are the spores of the fungus. The fungus is carried by the beetles when they feed on the twigs and branches of walnuts. When they enter, the beetles make a gallery as bark beetles will, and these are very tiny bark beetles, and they smear the spores of the fungus in this wound. The fungus then grows and produces a dead area, and the area in a susceptible host, such as black walnut, might be the size of a quarter or more from a single introduction of a beetle. These cankers increase in number with increased number of attacks by the beetles, and over time they may coalesce and cause extensive loss of tissue to the tree, which results in declines. So this is a disease that requires sustained introductions of a fungus by a twig beetle in a susceptible host. And we have two players. Who's on first? Who's more important, the beetle or the fungus? This is something where you can't really separate them. They're both important. You can't have thousand cankers unless both of them are doing well, and they do well in this part of the country. When this first came to attention, when we're first describing this, large numbers of black walnut were dying, and the onset of death was often quite rapid after symptoms occurred. So you'd see a tree that shows a little flagging, and usually the next year or the year after that, the tree was dead. So here's a tree, a little bit of flagging, that tree was dead the following year. A series of a tree here that in June you can see a little flagging on the left. September of that year, a little more dieback, dead the following June. This is the situation that we had with this as it first became evident and was understood when we described this in 2008. Death from thousand cankers in this part of the country was dramatic. the curve of loss of trees of black walnut were very similar to what we had in the initial years of Dutch elm disease. And in many areas of Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, where thousand cankers disease has been present, losses of black walnut have approached 100%. In fact, we think we lost all the black walnuts in western Colorado before we even knew that this disease, we knew anything about this disease. They were already gone. We just didn't know why. Anyway, why I'm putting this here, because this is actually an insect that is native to North America. The walnut twig beetle was originally collected in 1896 in New Mexico, later described, but it's native to parts of the United States. The native host of the where it was first collected from is a species of walnut that grows down in the southwestern part of the U.S., Arizona walnut. It also appears to have been associated with another host you find in Southern California walnut. Walnut twig beetle in Arizona walnut functions as a typical twig beetle. It causes dieback of limbs that are shaded or wounded, overshaded or wounded, but it doesn't kill them. It's just a pruner. You don't see trees dying. Black walnut is a very different situation. How did thousand cankers become a problem in black walnut? The beetle, with this Geosmithia, jumped hosts. People put black walnut in front of it, or people carried the beetle to areas where there was black walnut, and then it became a different insect. So it's not a pest in its native host. We had a host shift in this case. So black walnut being a super suscept host, Arizona walnut being a resistant host. And so this is another way that we do sometimes get insects developing as pests. They move on to a different host. And since I am doing this from Colorado, I want to point out perhaps our most famous insect from Colorado, the Colorado potato beetle, is one that did this. Colorado potato beetle, the world's most important potato insect, originally was developing on a plant we call buffalo burr, where it still is, but when people put potato in front of it, it found it like that too, and then moved to the east, and then took a boat and moved to Europe. Anyway, just a couple things, last things to say about thousand cankers disease. In this part of the country, thousand cankers disease has been an acute problem, resulting in massive amounts of tree death, rapid declines like I've just described. However, it does appear that there can be a chronic phase of this disease where it does not invariably progress to death. And it may be limited to just a few trees. So for instance, this is a tree that I've been watching in the town of Rocky Ford, which is down in southern Colorado, which is the first place I noticed this disease. And in this community, 95% of the black walnut died within the first decade, but there's one tree here and one tree there. So this is a tree I've been watching since 2010, and you can see that it's still hanging on. So in some places, there are some trees that are resisting this for reasons that are still a mystery. So there does seem to be a chronic phase to this. And in the East, where thousand cankers has been introduced, say Tennessee, Pennsylvania, a couple places like that, this also seems to be the case. For some reason, either the beetle or the or the fungus just is not doing well, and the disease does not develop in those other areas. But here, it's still occurring. We're getting new areas that get infested, and this year it's kind of moving down the Platte. We got the little town of Brush. Before that, it was Fort Morgan. Most of the trees are dying in these areas where we're seeing new infestations. Town where I live in Fort Collins, in the upper part of the picture, we first found thousand cankers probably 8 years ago, and I think we may have one tree left out of some 900 by the end of this year. What I think is perhaps most interesting are situations where we had an insect come into the area and it's been a big deal and then goes away. That happens. It happens often. So a fairly recent example involves another insect on elm called the European elm flea weevil, kind of a weird little weevil, a jumping weevil that affects elm trees. It produces a combination of injuries. The adults make little holes in the leaves, and the young develops as a leaf miner, makes a little blotch leaf mine at the tip of elm trees. So larval mines, again, serpentine meander, they terminate at a blotch at the leaf edge. And then the adults feed and cause shot holing, and when you have a large number of these, it's pretty dramatic. And during the outbreak period of this, I mean, the elms all over the state look like Swiss cheese. This insect was unknown in the western United States until 2006. It undoubtedly was here earlier, but we caught on to it and recognized it only in 2006. And at that point, we could find it in every county of the state. And when I would go to Arizona, and when I would go to Wyoming or Montana, I could find it there as well. It became the dominant insect defoliator of elm trees during this period. The trees would, again, look massively shot holed, mostly from the adult feeding. 2006, 2007, 2008, building. And then the question we started when we were talking about this in 2012 is something happening? It seems to be slowing down. Are natural enemies finally catching up? And we were finding little wasps, not a particularly good picture of them in the middle of this shot right here, but little wasps that were attacking them. And so the question was, is something finally getting onto them? And yes, it was. Yes, they were. The insect ended up being heavily parasitized. So after the peak year of maybe 2011, this insect declined. And it's declined to this point where it is hard to even find. A dozen years ago, it was everywhere. Now it is gone. Another thing happened a decade before that with what we'll call the brown-headed ash sawfly, an insect that is native to the eastern U.S. but hadn't found its way into Colorado until the early 2000s. The adults come out very early and insert their eggs along the edges of elm leaves. The young that feed that hatch from those eggs and originally make little shot holes, but then they do a more generalized feeding. And in outbreaks will completely defoliate the plants. And the picture on the right shows them. There's so many, they're just massed around the base of the trees. They completely defoliated the trees. And for 2 years during the early 2000s, the brown-headed ash sawfly was Colorado's bug of the year. I always try to have a bug of the year. So this was the most significant one. Just spectacular outbreaks. But the pattern of this insect, as it moved through the state, kind of changed. So it was originally found in an area, kind of the center of this picture here, Canyon City, and then it moved into Colorado Springs and Pueblo, and then it moved up into the Denver area, and then moved a little further north along the Front Range. And in the initial phases of this, when it would get into a new town, when you'd first see it, the problems were quite acute. We'd see these massive outbreaks for the first 2 or 3 years after it became established at a site, and attracted a lot of attention. The worms were everywhere. And then it started to decline. Natural enemies have been identified from this, and problems, the situation with this is usually after about 3 years, problems decline to insignificance. And I would say that this insect, nobody cares about it anymore. It's a rarity to find it. So it took a little while. It took 2-3 years, but natural enemies were there, and they ultimately brought it around. So again, it marched up. By the time it got where I live, up in the northern part of the state, it was pretty much attenuated and maybe had an outbreak for 1 year, and then the natural enemies crushed it. An insect that was big for a while went away. And then one of the more interesting things I think that's happened on elm is what I called the elm bark beetle handoff. So I think most people know about the smaller European elm bark beetle. This is the beetle that came over from Europe along with the fungal pathogens that produce Dutch elm disease. And Dutch elm disease with this beetle got to this part of the country and caused havoc here as it did elsewhere. But in 2003, Dave Leatherman, the former entomologist for the Forest Service, State Forest Service, happened to notice that it looked like there was another kind of bark beetle in the elms, turned out to be called the banded elm bark beetle. And following his observation, it was found to be present not only throughout Colorado at that point in time, but in 12 other states in 2003. This banded elm bark beetle has very similar habits to the smaller European elm bark beetle. Both of them will feed on the twigs and the adults. And in this case, in that feeding, they could introduce the fungus of Dutch elm disease. The larvae then develop in the limbs and trunk of the tree, particularly parts of the tree that are drought stressed or injured. But despite having the same habits and occurring in the same ecological niche, they have slightly different phenologies. So the banded elm bark beetle comes out a little bit earlier than the smaller European elm bark beetle. They're feeding in the same way, they're doing the same thing, but one comes out a little earlier. And then there's a second generation, and it's also earlier. The new one is a little earlier. And this situation results in the banded elm bark beetle winning. So what has happened in a remarkably short period of time is within 10 years after we found this insect to be present in the western states, this new elm bark beetle seems to have locally extirpated the previous invasive bark beetle. So it is hard to find the smaller European elm bark beetle anymore, if you can find it at all. So one invasive has taken out a previous invasive in this case. Kind of a situation like that happened, a slightly different situation, but happened a couple decades before on honey locust. When I first came here, the primary insect that we had on our honey locust was honey locust podgall midge. It's a gall-making midge that causes the new leaflets to curl and turn into a little pod. The young develop in those pods and then emerge, and as long as new growth is coming out, they'll produce a second generation, a third generation. So that was the dominant insect you would see on honey locust in the early mid-1980s. Then the honey locust plant bug came in. Just hadn't made it to the state yet, but got into the state and started showing up in damaging populations in the late 1980s. Now, the honey locust plant bug feeds in a very different way. It feeds on the new growth as well, but it feeds with piercing, sucking mouthparts in a very destructive manner. It's called lacerate and flush. So wherever they feed, the tissues die. So they kill the new growth. This destroys the cells at the feeding site. And so the kind of symptoms we'll see with honey locust plant bug will be maybe thinning from the new growth early in the year being killed back. Anyway, the effect of this on the previous insect has been pretty dramatic. Honey locust podgall midge is hard to find anymore. Both species develop on the developing leaves of honey locust, but the honey locust podgall midge requires new growth to be intact for it to make that gall and live within that gall. The honey locust plant bug comes by, feeds with its lacerate and flush mouth parts, kills the cells, kills the tissues that maybe the podgall midge is trying to develop in, so it dies, and maybe it even feeds on the podgall midge. But in any case, the honey locust plant bug wins. We are now a honey locust plant bug state instead of a podgall midge state. One took out the other. And then perhaps the mystery insect that baffles me the most is elm leaf beetle. This used to be the dominant insect defoliator of our urban forests, elm leaf beetle. And not only here, across the Midwest, elm leaf beetle. You know, the adults chew little holes in the leaves, they lay eggs on the leaves, the eggs hatch, and then you get the young that cause skeletonizing injury. And particularly conspicuous skeletonizing injury to the leaves. And this would occur regularly. I mean, there would be one generation, the trees would turn gray. They produce some new leaves, they turn gray with the second generation. That was normal. Then, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the insects started to go down. It started to vanish. This is an insect that is very hard to find in most of the areas where it used to be abundant. There's a little pocket in southern Colorado, southeast Colorado, where you can find it fairly regularly, but it used to be everywhere. And it used to be in Kansas, and it used to be in Ohio, and it's gone. This is an insect we hardly talk about anymore. What happened? Nobody knows. But it was an invasive insect. It was a non-native insect. It came from Europe, loved our elms, was bad for a long time, decades, and went away. There's a mystery there. Somebody should figure that out. So, this most important elm leaf, we've had 2 defoliators on elm. Elm leaf flea beetle came in 2006, had a run for about 5 years, then crashed. And the elm leaf beetle was important for decades, but then started crashing in the late 1980s and early 1990s over a wide area. And then finally, what can happen when a new bug gets into a state is it can establish and become a permanent major pest. And we have a couple of cases now where that would be the situation. Emerald ash borer being the big kahuna. This is something that we have now and is clearly a serious pest that is not going to go away. Just a little background, though, things will work out with this insect, I think, a little differently in the West than it has elsewhere. The situation in Colorado started in 2013. This is the first tree we found in the city of Boulder. So somewhere in this part of it's downtown Boulder, it was brought in by somebody probably 6-8 years before from the Midwest. Over the next 3 years, it essentially colonized the entire area of downtown Boulder and has spread to some degree since then. So in the past 4 years, from the initial time we found it, it has spread about 15 miles in a couple of different directions to the nearby towns. It is still confined to a single county, and but is starting to break out here. Now, I do want to say one thing about this that I think is important for other states in the West, or this part of the West, when we get emerald ash borer. We have geography here that makes the subsequent spread of the insect very different than what you're going to see elsewhere. We're compartmentalized by mountains, and I would consider our state to be made up of various river drainages. So the current infestation is in the part of the state called the South Platte, and I think over time that area it will spread, but there's no way it will spread out of here without humans moving it. There's no way it's going to get from Boulder to, say, Grand Junction or Durango or Colorado Springs. People are going to have to move it. We are, unlike in the Midwest, where there's no such geographic barriers. In the West, we have significant geographic barriers. And then the insect that's attracted most of my time in the last couple of years is Japanese beetle. Japanese beetle finally made it, and Colorado is also the first Western state to have well-established populations now of this insect. This is going to probably affect how we use certain kinds of plants in the urban environment. The tree shown on the left is linden, a uber host for this. It is an insect that is difficult for me to message because it's 2 different insects actually. The adults are something that feeds on the foliage and on the leaves and on the flowers of certain kinds of plants, and flowers that are sometimes what we wish to preserve, making use of insecticides particularly problematic if you've got pollinators visiting, but it also is a turfgrass pest in the larval stage, pruning the roots and becoming a significant white grub problem. Anyway, This is an insect that has been introduced countless times into the state, never really took until about mid-2000s. And then in 2 areas around golf courses in the southern Denver area, it was clear that it was reproducing. Subsequently, there was trapping put out, and it was found in 2008 that it spread quite a bit. But now it is taken extremely well. We have a large expanding population that essentially covers the entire Denver metro area. We have a separate introduction to the south that covers Pueblo, and it is spreading. That little arrow on the top is my town, and we have found it here too. I'm going to stop at this point in time. I think I've got a little more than I put, and I'll take questions. So I'll go back to this. So how do we work this? Any way to
So
get
I think Lauren is going to field our questions for us. Lauren? And we're not hearing you if you're, or seeing you if you're speaking, Lauren.
Am I back?
You are.
Okay.
Yes.
First question is, after the poplar, I can't pronounce this, twigglefly,
Yeah.
has moved out of an aspen stem and in the galls, and if the galls continue to grow, do they cause the wood to become weak, or does the tree build reaction wood to counteract the damage?
It produces reaction wood. We're not seeing any kind of weakening. It's just a lumpy aspen, and and you don't even notice it until the leaves come off. But then the leaves come off, and they go, "Oh my God, my aspen looks weird." No, it does not have any structural effect. It's just lumpy, but it's an ornamental plant, and people don't like it when it's lumpy. I think it makes it more attractive, but different strokes for different folks.
Thank you. There's there's some talk about in the chat window about Dutch elm disease. Can you elaborate on if banded elm beetle transmits this, or if you have any papers or studies that you would suggest we read?
Banded elm bark beetle does transmit the pathogen for Dutch elm disease, and I think it's probably a wash. It's probably equally as effective as a vector for the pathogen, the fungus that produces Dutch elm disease. So in that case, that situation is not changed. We just swapped different competent vectors. I would like to point out that Dutch elm disease in this part of the country is under excellent control because through sanitation. We do not have wild reservoirs of the disease. I mean, all American elm are under people's care, and they are watched. And if we get Dutch elm disease, those trees are immediately eliminated. We have better stands of American elm out here than you'll find anywhere else in the country. Our problem on American elm is European elm scale, which is another issue because it's become resistant to insecticides. But anyway, no, it's a competent vector. So, but I think we're going to find when we look that banded elm bark beetle has kind of swept in. Nobody was even looking for it, swept in and taken out the other one over a large area of the United States.
Okay. Do you know how far the emerald ash borer is advanced towards the east?
To the east, I mean, essentially every state pretty much to the east of us has it. I mean, Colorado, I should show a map of the current distribution of it. It is found in eastern Kansas, it's found in eastern Nebraska, but then Colorado, where we have it, is a jump. Somebody carried it over the Great Plains and gave it to us. I'd have to look at a map, but it's some 26 states have it. Most states have it. But the way it's going to spread in the western state is going to be different. I mean, our towns, we don't have continuous areas of ash. We have a town and then miles without an ash tree. And it's going to spread differently in western state. A lot of things are going to be different with emerald ash borer in this part of the country than elsewhere. But I think we can control emerald ash borer better than we can control elsewhere.
You know what? The panelist actually asked how far west it has traveled, not east.
Well, we're at Boulder County, the city of Boulder. That's the westernmost place where it has been found anywhere in the United States. So.
Okay. What was the X for near Grand Junction?
Oh, for the Japanese beetle was actually eradicated from a small town in western Colorado several years ago, the town of Palisade, a very small town, agricultural area, so it's quite important, particularly for the grape production there. But over about 5-year period, through treating essentially every lawn, massive use of traps, doing some dry down of lawns, it was able to be eradicated, so that now we can say west of the Continental Divide, western Colorado, we do not have Japanese beetle. And that's important because that's an insect that is a quarantine pest, but we certainly have it now here in eastern Colorado. But again, that was a small town. Everybody was on board. It took about 5 years for them to get it out, but that's one of the only cases where Japanese beetle has ever been eradicated. It occurred in that little town of Palisade.
Can you talk about if climate change has an effect on the distribution or spread of the insects that you've discussed?
Good question. I mean, I don't know specifically sort of some of the ones on shade tree insects, but this the thing I tell people for how things have changed is a different example. I work with vegetable insects and a lot, and when I first started this job in early 1980s, I worked down in southeast Colorado in area on vegetable insects down there. And there was a suite of insects that were down there, squash bugs, cucumber beetles, southern cabbage worm, things like that, that up in northern Colorado I would never see, or really rare. In the 30-odd years that I have lived here, the kinds of insects that were down in southeast Colorado on vegetables are now the insects that are in northern Colorado. They've moved 250 miles north. Now, those I've got a good feeling for in terms of shade trees. I'm sure there's been effects on that as well. But things have changed. The insects are moving north, and well, for shade tree insects, I mean, one example I can think of is cicadas. We never have the cicadas up here. Now we've got cicadas buzzing in the trees in northern Colorado. That wasn't the case before. But I don't know. It undoubtedly has effects. I mean, with one of the probably more important things might be extra generations getting completed, or insects getting out of sync with host plants in different ways. But anyway, something's happening, and I see it certainly in the vegetable insects, but I'm sure it's happening with woody plants as well.
Whitney, could you close your start menu on your screen so that the folks could still see the whole map?
Oh, sorry. Back.
Thank you. And we've got a lot of participants with a lot of questions, so if it's all right, I'm going to keep going for another 5 or so minutes.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mountain pine beetle shows a pattern of boom and bust. Is there something about the urban environment that does not enable persistence?
Probably better, trees are better hydrated and they're not as concentrated. The outbreak that we did have involved trees that the outbreak was largely facilitated by having uniform stands of overmature trees, overcrowded, and the primary way that trees defend themselves is through this pitch out response, through producing abundant pitch, and that can be really a robust response in a well-hydrated situation. So I think that's a large part of it. That's also the reason that spruce hips, that insect came out of nowhere, but when you looked at the trees, the spruce trees in 2003, I mean, you could crack them like like a matchstick in that year, and then it rained again, and the trees were able to respond to spruce hips a lot better through their own innate defense, mostly pitch out. So hydration is the most important thing, I think.
Okay. And did the borer fly over to Denver, or did it move through and then end up in Denver?
It was throughout Denver, but I mean, what was obvious when I showed that that arrow where there was coming, the base of the arrow was where the gamble oak were, and the end of the arrow was a big planting of red oak in the old Stapleton Airport area, and those oaks were destroyed by gamble oak borer. So many of them attacking them in that wave. So, but others, fell out throughout the whole path of that arrow, and there were areas in southern Denver that also showed damage as well. But it at least moved 30 miles in such numbers that they could overwhelm tree defenses in a single season. It was an eye opener to me.
Are there any emerging ambrosia beetles on your radar?
Not yet. No, I mean, you hear about there's certainly ambrosia beetle issues, mostly in the southeast, and there's one big one in Southern California now. But no, I mean, the ambrosias beetle we have are just the ones that come in at the end when trees are already in decline, not the aggressive non-native ones. Maybe we'll get some. We often get things a little later than other people, but anyway, no, not yet.
Okay. It says most pests seem to come from the east. Are there many pests from the west, like in California, that have made it over to Colorado?
Well, I mean, how things, I mean, the winds go west to east. I mean, I think how most things come is on infested plant material, and most of our plant material comes from the Midwest, when people trucking it in here. Other plants would be trucked in from the Pacific Northwest as well. I don't know how much we get from California, but it would all be trucked in. None of them would get here. I mean, almost none of the things I've talked about would have gotten here without human assistance. I mean, on the east we have this enormous, area, the eastern plains, that are an absolute barrier to a lot of woody plant insects, but we squander that barrier by moving things in, and then we got the Rocky Mountains running up the middle of the state that insects aren't going to be moving across. But no, we've got probably some things from California, but I think most of our stuff, I blame Ohio and Michigan most often for giving us stuff.
Lauren, I'm going to jump in real quick. I just want folks to know we're going to launch a poll here. Please let us know. This just helps us sort of let us know how good a job we're doing, and allows us to give feedback. And but Lauren, let's just take another question or two, and then we'll wrap things up. I think Dave has a few closing remarks.
Okay, I'll answer the last question that just came in. Whitney, would you mind putting up that slide that has your email? So I know there was a ton of questions that came in the last 10 minutes, and that way people can email you.
Okay, I'm going to have to zip through. I was going to talk about the last thing I was going to talk about was the European paper wasp, which I didn't have time to talk about, which I think has had a huge impact on our region. But anyway, here's my contact information.
Thanks. And the last question that just came in, what is the most effective control measure for the boring and sucking insects that you've mentioned, given that most of the systemic insecticides have been taken off the market in the last couple decades?
Oh, it's too general a question. I mean, there's different products for borers, there's different products for sucking insects, and I can't answer that. If you give me a specific kind of insect, I can give you a recommendation. But and we still use, some of the systemic insecticides are used around here pretty effectively. We're doing a lot less tree spraying than we did when I first started this job, because we have some systemic insecticides that can do it without spraying the trees and blowing all over the neighborhood. So anyway, can't answer that one well.
Okay, Mark?
Okay, Dave, do you guys have some closing thoughts?
Just that we certainly welcome interest from the groups, since we help support putting on these webinars, as far as research needs and any interests in helping fund projects as well. So we definitely like the dialogue with different industries, so that we can make sure that we're supporting the areas that we need to.
All righty. Thanks everybody for their support and time. Whitney, thank you for your presentation. Any closing thoughts, Whitney?
No, I guess I'd also like to thank the Tree Fund for doing this, and the Tree Fund has helped support a project of ours. It's not one that I happen to mention, but it involves a situation on oak called drippy blight, and I thank the Tree Fund quite a bit for helping support that.
Okay, again, thanks to everyone. Again, the recording is being made here. Megan will follow up with an email that'll have a link to the recording. Also, if you got here via the Learn event on learn.extension.org, a link to that recording will be posted there within a few days. And with that, thanks to everyone, and everyone have a great rest of their day.
Okay, good, thanks.
Bye-bye.